Hello, my name's Anna Stenning. Thank you for coming to listen to my talk today. I am a woman in my 40s with shoulder-length brownish hair, and I'm in a room with cream walls and a window behind me. In this talk, I'll introduce two ideas that are central to my current research, and my research is generally a study of life writing by autistic authors. As I mentioned at the start of the festival, I'm interested in how individual and collective acts of storytelling can improve agency and recognition for autistic people, whether self-diagnosed or otherwise. And I think of narrative or storytelling as an act with political potential that spans the humanities and social sciences. I aim to show in this short talk the creative potential of stories for affecting change. And I don't believe that there is an essential or single story to tell about autism that has not been told before. Autistic narrators, and especially autistics who are multiply disabled or otherwise marginalised, are denied narrative agency and a narrative identity more than any other group. This has direct impacts on what we are allowed to do and how we are perceived by others. While narration might seem like something very abstract and literary, I believe it's essential to being able to make sense of our lives and subsequently to being recognised as unique human beings with the capacity to know what we want from life. But being able to do this is also dependent on being able to make sense to ourselves, which in turn depends on being heard by others who help us identify what is unique about our lives. An example could be this talk. I'm writing this with the hopes that ideas will make sense to you, the audience. I've already talked about some of the ideas with some other people who are vaguely familiar and sympathetic with my work. And this gives me the sense that it's possible for me to communicate to you. But there are other factors that will affect this particular narrative act, which is in fact a series of acts, a writing of a talk, a recording of an MP4, playing it here at the IR Festival by the facilitator. Other things come into this. I'm not sure as I'm a good speaker because I'm an atypical communicator for various reasons. I'm not sure if the language I use will be too technical or too everyday for everyone in the audience. And I wonder if my personal stories will be reached by a sympathetic audience, or one who finds it hard to relate to these experiences. And in another sense, I'm a narrator as a spectator on other people's narratives, the texts that I'm going to talk about later on. And even as I am sympathetic to them, I wonder if I will do them justice or oversimplify them. The ideas I introduce in this talk are the terms narrative agency and practical identity. These ideas come from political philosophy and have been most helpfully articulated by Sarah Lucas, who is a political theorist at the University of Exeter. The first term is narrative agency, which I believe is the capacity to say I over time and in relation to others. This also means having the confidence that I will appear to others as a distinct human being. So here, the idea of agency is relevant because this is the ability to perform an action that has a meaningful effect. Meaning, in my understanding, means something that is understood by another individual as it is intended by the speaker. Since this is about actions rather than words, saying here does not necessarily mean expressing something in words. It can be other forms of communication, including pictures and sounds. So through narrative agency, we communicate with others, whether it's in words or pictures or tones or gestures. Our capacity for narrative agency depends on the willingness and ability of other people to hear us and recognize us as communicators. So in my own example, my narrative agency in delivering this talk is determined by my experience of understanding my own perspective, which means the capacity to say I in relation to myself in communicating with others. It depends on B, my confidence in my ability to be recognized as a communicator with an individual standpoint. C, it depends on having an audience, and D, having a sympathetic audience. And in this, I think C and D are lesser important, since even making the talk without any listener means that I help to recognize myself as an individual and develop my self-understanding. I might see that I'm not as bad at speaking on camera than I thought I was. This might lead me to offer other talks in the future which demonstrate my narrative agency. Or perhaps it doesn't go well. Perhaps the talk isn't of interest to anyone in the audience. This will, in a sense, impact on my feelings of narrative agency. So I can expect you can think of many examples of your own where your communications have contributed something to your sense of self. that is positive. It could be something more straightforward than giving a talk, like giving someone you love a drawing or a hug or petting a cat. These are a kind of act of communication. And all of this is related to the narratives I will talk about later on. And they're not more or less important than written texts or talks, even though they are often seen as such in our culture. The second kind of abstract concept I'll talk about is practical identity. And this is the idea that who we think we are is made up of stories. And these are an unrepeatable configuration of narratives about what is important, what is more normal, and so on at any moment in time. So our practical identity changes throughout our lives. And we reveal this identity to others through our actions and in speech. And as before, these actions could include drawing or other kinds of communication. And I believe there's seldom any single story that can define us. And our capacity to provide a story that others understand is also dependent on factors outside of our control, including unhelpful norms imposed on us by society. Both of these two concepts, narrative agency and practical identity, make use of the idea of a narrator, who is basically someone who tells a story in any form. However, Lucas argues that we can be a narrator in two senses. We can chronicle our own and other people's lives in the public realm as a spectator, and we can narrate to take part in action as an agent. And this talk involves both kinds of narration. I'm talking about my own life and I'm talking about other people's lives. When we talk about other people's lives as spectators, we will always change the meanings of the events in the search for an illusory wholeness that we can communicate. So I'm going to give a bit of an example from my own life. I am a late diagnosed autistic and ADHD white cisgender woman in her 40s. Some of the stories about me: I love growing things, I love music, film, and many other hobbies. I'm a postdoctoral researcher on a fellowship from the Wellcome Trust, and I have a comfortable home and a loving chosen family. But also during my life, I have experienced underemployment, loss, anxiety. I've experienced homelessness, and both painful and joyful experiences. And I found that a lot of these experiences are often resonating with the life writing that I'm reading. I also have chronic pain as a result of a degenerative joint problem, which for some reason I find harder to share with people than my autism. And perhaps this is because I don't yet know where this will lead. Will I, like my brother, be unable to walk by the time I am 50? It's hard to put all of these different aspects of my life into coherent narrative defined by a single idea. I couldn't fit it all together in terms of an idea of possible recovery or cure, but I feel far from having a sense of chaos about my life. I have a strong sense of the possibility of healing through storytelling and recognition of our shared human vulnerability and interdependence with each other and the natural world. Within the field of life writing studies, this would involve rethinking the nature of selfhood as defined by Western psychology, focusing less on individuals and developing an ethic of collective care. When I come to sharing my experiences in more public events such as this festival, it is harder than in my community settings, because I become part of other people's stories in ways that are unhelpful to me sometimes, and also potentially in ways that could be unhelpful to others, whether that's as a neurodivergent person, a woman, or anything else. As an academic, like many people, I have experiences of fitting and misfitting, latter of which in relation to my comprehensive school background, my gender identity, my neurostatus. In many ways, I believe that academia is less able to accept differences than in many other fields I've worked in, and I seldom meet people who I think of as like me, except in computing and technology departments. However, since I'm based in literary studies, I'm hoping that this standpoint has a political potential, using my own autistic gaze as a starting point, and turning it to specifically literary questions about language, symbolism, structure, irony, and the use of fictionalized narrators, which I think are often overlooked in life writing. In this way, I offer my own acts of recognition to other autistic communicators. But the problem is that without other people's recognition for what I'm doing, it is easy to represent me as doing all of what I do unintentionally as some kind of symptom of my autistic neurology. One particular feature of the life writing I'm interested in includes the construction of narrators who I consider to be knowingly or slyly naive about the meanings of autism or other aspects of their identity, so they can show the development, the premeditated development of an understanding of their life through time. This requires understanding on the part of the reader to recognize that the author has intentions and that these might be different from their own. For instance, that they might assume that autistic narrators aren't capable of premeditation. Otherwise, this deliberate naivety will be recognized as just another feature of autism. And I'll go on to talk about what this means in a few examples. Literary theorists have taken on some of these ideas in terms of the idea of narrative acts and relational identity. And these are most widely known in connection to Julia Watson and Sydney Smith's influential work, Reading Autobiography, Autobiographical Acts. Smith and Watson talk about oral testimony in written text as crafted creative acts made in collaboration with others, rather than as direct transcription of events. They focus on the relational encounter between a coaxer, who is a potential or actual audience, and an autobiographical subject. And they talk about this in relation to issues of translation and editorial control. However, they don't talk about how power imbalances may affect how the subject makes deliberate choices about how they tell their story. So perhaps in the effort to find objective and generalizable truths about what narrators and readers do, there is very little attention to the flesh and blood author. However, Watson and Smith do start to raise the fact that it's a risky business to try and voice experiences that are regarded as taboo or uncomfortable in terms of one's perceived social identity. But there is little said about how we can overcome this. So in an early work by Sydney Smith, autistic people are considered the limit to a subject who can be regarded as having a narratable self. And this is described as both due to features inherent to autism and about how storytelling works. And I quote, "High-functioning autistics apparently learn by rote the technologies of selfhood, the self-identifications, the narratives, behaviors, emotional scripts through which people in their cultures make sense of the world and their cultures." And here, as often, autism operates, as it does in mainstream culture, as a symbol of a kind of semi-human status, someone who is only able to achieve apparent humanity by hacking or imitating other behaviors. And what I think is wrong about this approach isn't just the attitude to autism, but that helps to give it away. Autism isn't about lacking an innate ability to tell stories. There simply isn't any evidence to suggest this. Instead, what happens is that we are denied opportunities to take part in exchanges that help us to recognize ourselves as individuals. And as for cultural scripts, who says that these are fixed in advance? So in my theory, narrative acts include both everyday communicative exchanges, not limited to verbal communication, and acts of recording and sharing our experiences, including in photographs, so that they endure over longer periods. Narrative acts depend on a process of communication in which we are only able to recognize ourselves as narrators if we are in part of a community in which we will be listened to and recognized. This means that even if we recognize our uniqueness, that we are not just another autistic person or woman or 40-year-old, or whichever label is used to describe us, we need to be able to find a way to express that to another person who may not want to accept the validity of our standpoint. And I'd like to talk about a few examples where I see from life writing autistic narrators attempting to create this narratable standpoint. Temple Grandin talks about her life in terms of what I think is a kind of deliberate naivety about what other people might think about autism. And I quote, "Now, as a teenager, communication should be established, but the chasm of misunderstanding was deep. Was it because I was autistic and my parents were not? My parents did not understand my logic, and I, being a visual thinker, did not understand theirs. In reality, our uniqueness will depend on an identity that intersects with many different markers of identity. So in more recent texts, we see authors talking about their lives in terms of intersections of gender, race, and disability. Anand Prahlad, who was born Black and autistic in 1950s America, felt that he had to hide many aspects of what he thought made him unique because he would not be loved if he did. Once I was in relationships, I didn't know where to put the secret parts of me. I'd learned from childhood not to trust them. They weren't acceptable. My wife was from a world where the only places for those parts of me were closets or cages. It was like that with most of my girlfriends. They were white and they knew how the white world worked. Even if they disowned it or felt they didn't fit in, they were straight, they were neurologically typical, they were moral. They had a sense of structure and could communicate and hold jobs. So here, the narrator isn't deliberately naive, but they are expressing to the reader why they couldn't describe their lives to others in terms of the aspects of themselves that they thought were unique. And in many cases, we may struggle to find terms to understand and communicate our uniqueness because we lack a culturally sanctioned idea about what that is. And the terms that we use to convey our experiences may be unknown to most people. For this reason, we may fall back on concepts that are stigmatizing and subordinating for us. This happens quite a lot in Donna Williams's first memoir, Nobody Nowhere. And I quote, "I do not think I am mad, though at times I was convinced by the beliefs of those around me that I must have been so. Certainly, however, if I had the predisposition to become truly mentally ill, then I'm sure that my isolation within my mental prison would have caused enough stress to do this." One script that seems to dominate many cultural and medical understandings of autism is that autistics lack introspective awareness. It seems to be the basis upon which many individual autistic people are unable to recognize as narrators. But as we move through our lives, we are unlikely to experience ourselves of any one cultural script. In the case of Nobody Nowhere, Donna Williams moves beyond the idea that she is mad, certainly in the sense of the pathologizing sense that she's been given by her family. And it would be likely that we may move from different subordinating stories, such as those that we experience as a result of our atypical embodiment, gender, race, or sexuality. So at one point, Donna Williams talks about herself in terms of a kind of generalized and passive femininity. To respond to this, we can create new reading practices that pay attention to the levels of intentionality manifest in autistic life texts through tracking different possible responses to them. We can look at how they try to speak back to dominant understandings through active engagement in the political realm. However, this places a burden on the individual narrator, since they are subject to the disciplining attention either of those within their normative frameworks, or it risks harming others who would be affected by the stories we tell. For instance, and in the case of Temple Grandin's story, the idea that we are thinking in pictures, which certainly isn't something that all autistics identify with. However, we can also look at multiple narrator masks that embody different subordinating positions or cultural roles. Cindy Facteau talks about this in All the Weight of Our Dreams. "I didn't realize that the only way for this person to live, the one with a job, degree, house, autonomy, respect, was that the other had to die, has to hide, has to be shoved down and made imaginary. The bawling, suffering, terrifying, terrified and abused monster has to die so this person could live." In Facteau's account, the other is the perceived and negative cultural understanding of her autistic self, which is exacerbated by attitudes towards her racial identity. So she creates a persona that allow her to also have a sense that she may be able to move beyond those labels, but each has a kind of validity to her own self-concept. Authors can also create a fiction, a psychodrama that externalizes certain understandings of oneself that would otherwise be hidden. And again, quoting Anand Prahlad from his book, The Secret Life of a Black Aspie, "I would meet other beings in space who would be like me, who would talk to me like plants or spirits without any words. The way the stars talk with patterns of light, beings who would not look at me." And as mentioned before, we can create a deliberately naive narrator who develops an experiencing self moving between different roles in response to our circumstances and the need to create a pragmatic identity. And this is what Donna Williams or Polly Samuels does with the characters of Donna, Willie, and Carol in Nobody Nowhere. These are all different versions of herself that she creates to respond to the demands of the external world. We can also highlight everyday exchanges that have helped to to shape our internalized understandings of our identity, whether that's autism or any other socially situated identity marker, as this record of an email exchange between the authors of Women from Another Planet reveals. I'm learning that success is being able to live the lifestyle you feel most at home in, and the kinds of people you're around who tell you you're all right, you're great and unique, who still like you even after something upsetting happens. Helping people, but not really noticed and glorified. As new communities form based on shared understandings about autism, we may increase our potential to be recognised as individuals with a valid point of view. And this is a quote from the collection Loud Hands. You have the right, or should, to grow in ways that are good for you, that you think are good for you. You have the right to make changes in your life that you think are the correct ones for you. When others choose for you, in the case of children or in some support roles, let it not be in the vain attempt to normalize you, but to help you be your best autistic self. So here's an expression of an emerging self-understanding, here related in a collective sense as you, within a community which is attentive and caring of others with the same identity. However, as the new communities emerge, these will also become governed by norms that will constantly need updating to support the people that join that community. But what the community offers is a situation in which we can recompose ourselves with a chance to be seen as we wish to be seen, to have others view us as we wish to be, and to have a chance to change how others see us. It is through this that we can go on to represent ourselves to others outside of our immediate community with confidence that we have the support that we need. So I'd like to end this brief presentation with a longer quote from a text by Amanda Forrest Vivian, which is called Run Forest Run, about movement and love, reproduced also in the collection Loud Hands, Autistic People Speaking from 2012. Amanda has since written elsewhere on the subject of stimming, and the quote sums up more eloquently than I can some of the ideas I've been talking about today. Amanda's essay is accompanied by pictures that narrate the process of developing an affirmative self-recognition, which is then essential to being able to have narrative agency in the civic realm. It shows the essential role of community recognition in starting this process. She talks about a series of pictures that she took, which she's taken to understand her own stimming. She says, I took these pictures because I didn't know what I looked like when I was stimming, and I assumed it probably looked scary. As soon as I started liking them, I realized it looked sort of cool, at least in the pictures, so I took a lot more. Before, I didn't have an image of what a person who stimmed looked like. I'm not saying I was raised to feel terrible about stimming, because I wasn't really cracked down on by teachers and parents, like some people are. But it was sort of similar to how I felt about being queer. I either heard vague negative stuff or silence. I saw people on the internet saying it was okay, but I had trouble applying it to my real life. So here, Amanda shows the importance of developing a shared language and set of experience to narrate our lives without fear of being misjudged or accused of breaking cultural tools, and for not communicating in the right ways to have our viewpoints accepted. And this shows the difference between what I think Sarah Lucas calls living to tell about it and telling to live, which is the prior but essential act of sense-making to ourselves about what has happened. And while scholars of life writing have traditionally focused on the former, on living to tell about it, the works that I've looked at have a lot to say about the latter, which is telling to live.